Imagine being a millionaire, living a life of luxury, surrounded by the finest things money can buy. But then, one day, you wake up and realize that all the wealth and status you've carefully built around yourself feel like nothing more than an elaborate mask. It's a life of empty pleasures, and no matter how much you have, you can't shake the feeling that something is missing. That's exactly what happened to Mark Thompson. On the outside, he was the picture of success. Expensive suits, a private jet, an extravagant mansion. But behind the closed doors of his lavish life, Mark had begun to feel isolated, disconnected from the real world. He couldn't trust anyone around him. They didn't know the real him. They only knew the man with endless money and power. The more he realized this, the more his wealth started to feel like a prison. Mark needed a change, and so, Mark did something few people would even consider. He decided to give up his extravagant lifestyle, for a while at least. But instead of just living a quiet life, far from the spotlight, he decided to do something completely out of character. He was going to go to work at his own factory. He would give up the designer clothes and private drivers for a few weeks, wear regular clothes, and pretend to be a regular worker. Why? Well, that's the mystery. He wasn't just interested in checking in on his employees. He was looking for something deeper. For Mark, this was about discovering a life that wasn't tied to his wealth, a life that could bring him real human connections. The factory, a place where hundreds of employees worked day in and day out, was the perfect setting for him to escape the fake world he'd built. And so, Mark walked through those factory doors that first day, disguised as just another employee, with no one knowing the truth about who he was. He was determined to blend in, to disappear in plain sight. But things didn't go exactly as planned. At first, Mark thought it would be simple. He'd work for a few weeks, get a taste of the real world, and go back to his life as usual. But life had other plans. The moment Mark stepped into the factory, he met Emma, a woman whose presence seemed to cut through the chaos of the factory floor like a breath of fresh air. Emma was sharp, hard-working, and passionate about her job. But there was something else about her that caught Mark's attention. She wasn't impressed by his wealth or status. She treated him just like any other employee. And that, Mark realized, was something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Genuine, no strings attached respect. At first, it wasn't anything romantic. In fact, Mark barely even noticed how drawn he was to her. He was focused on blending in and getting to know the workers around him. But the more he worked alongside Emma, the more he found himself intrigued. She had this energy about her, an authenticity that seemed so rare in his world. While everyone around him was pretending to be someone they weren't, Emma was as real as they come. As the days went by, Mark found himself looking forward to his shifts, just to see Emma. Their conversations, often simple at first, began to dive deeper. They talked about everything from the challenges of factory life to their dreams and aspirations. And the more they talked, the more Mark realized something. He was starting to fall for her. But there was a huge problem. Emma had no idea who he really was. She thought he was just another worker. Mark couldn't bring himself to tell her the truth. How could he? If she found out he was the owner of the factory, would she treat him differently? Would she be upset that he'd been pretending to be someone else? Or worse, would she think he was just another rich guy trying to play normal for a while? The tension between them started to grow. Mark was torn. On one hand, he was falling for Emma in a way that felt real, something he hadn't felt in years. But on the other hand, he was hiding the truth about who he really was. And then there was the fear that the moment she found out, everything would change. It wasn't just Emma that Mark was hiding the truth from. The entire factory was full of hard-working people who had no idea that the man they were working alongside wasn't just an ordinary worker, but the very man who owned the company they worked for. That secret weighed on him more than he cared to admit. Mark was beginning to wonder if he was losing touch with reality. Was he really starting to love Emma for who she was? Or was it just the feeling of being seen as an equal? Something that had eluded him for so long. It's at this point that Mark is forced to confront his own dilemma. He realizes he can't keep living a lie forever. He knows he has to tell Emma the truth, but he fears the consequences. What if she hates him for deceiving her? What if she feels betrayed? The tension builds, and Mark knows that the next step could either be the beginning of something real or the end of everything he's built. But just as he's about to make a decision, an unexpected event shakes everything up. A sudden crisis at the factory. A problem arises that threatens the livelihood of everyone who works there. Mark must decide whether to reveal his true identity and use his wealth and resources to help or continue to pretend that he's just another worker. The clock is ticking, and every moment that passes feels like a step closer to the truth being exposed. What will Mark do? Will he finally come clean to Emma, risking it all for the chance at a real connection? Or will he continue to hide in plain sight, hoping to find love while keeping his secrets intact? And what about Emma? How will she react when the truth comes to light? The story is far from over, but one thing is certain. Mark's journey is just beginning, and the path ahead is filled with difficult choices, unexpected twists, and emotions that none of them could have predicted. Stay tuned to see what happens next. The days that followed were full of tension for Mark. He couldn't shake the weight of the secret he was carrying. Every time he locked eyes with Emma across the factory floor, he felt a mix of dread and longing. What would she think if she knew the truth? Would she still look at him with the same warmth and respect? Or would everything between them shatter? In an instant, Mark had always been a man of control. In the world of business, he was a strategist, a master of manipulating situations to his advantage. But here, in the factory, in the midst of the noise and hard work, he felt completely out of his element. Emma had a way of looking at him that made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. She was strong, independent, and unafraid to speak her mind. In many ways, she was the opposite of the women he was used to. Those who only saw him as a wealthy businessman with connections to give. Emma didn't care about any of that. She didn't even know it. And that was both terrifying and exhilarating. For Mark, still, the longer he worked beside her, the more he realized how deeply connected he had become to the people in that factory. The employees were more than just workers to him. They were real people with real lives, dreams, and struggles. Mark had spent so many years surrounded by people who wanted something from him, people who never saw him as more than a means to an end. But here, among the workers, he finally felt like he was seeing what true human connection looked like. They didn't care about his money or status. They didn't care about who he was outside of this place. They cared about getting the job done and supporting each other. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Mark and Emma sat on a bench outside the factory, taking a rare break. The sky had turned a deep shade of purple as the last hints of daylight faded away, and the factory was quieter than usual. Most of the workers had already left for the day, but Mark stayed behind, helping with some last-minute tasks. Emma had stayed too, offering her help where it was needed. And now, here they were, sitting in silence, catching their breath. "You're quiet tonight," Emma said softly, breaking the stillness. Her voice was calm, but Mark could hear the curiosity in it. Mark hesitated, unsure of what to say. His thoughts were tangled. caught between his desire to be truthful with her and the fear of what would happen if he did. "Just thinking," he said, finally, "about everything. This place, it's a lot different from what I imagined." Emma smiled, but it wasn't one of those fake, polite smiles. It was genuine. "Yeah, it's not glamorous, but it's real. There's something honest about it. You know, in a way. This place makes you appreciate the little things. People don't always get that." Mark found himself nodding, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it, the moment he had been dreading, yet hoping for. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to say the words that had been suffocating him for weeks. But before he could speak, the factory doors suddenly creaked open. It was Carl, one of the senior managers. His face was pale, and his movements were quick, almost frantic. "Mark, I need you inside. There's a problem," Carl said, his voice tight with urgency. Without thinking, Mark stood up and followed Carl into the building. Emma stayed behind, her eyes following them, confusion written on her face. Once inside, Mark was greeted with a scene of chaos. Several workers were gathered around a machine, their faces etched with worry. It was a critical piece of equipment, one that had just malfunctioned in the middle of production, and if it couldn't be repaired quickly, it could lead to delays and lost income. Mark was no engineer, but he knew the stakes. The factory relied on this machinery to produce the goods that kept everything running. Without it, the entire operation could come to a halt. As the workers scrambled to figure out a solution, Mark's mind raced. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of the situation hanging over him like a storm cloud. And that's when it hit him. This was the moment that could change everything. He was no longer just a spectator in his own life. He could either step up and use the resources at his disposal to fix this problem, or he could remain hidden in the shadows, pretending to be just another worker. The workers, unaware of his true identity, looked to him for guidance, and in that moment, Mark knew what he had to do. He couldn't keep pretending. He couldn't keep hiding behind his false identity. He had to take control, not just for the factory, but for himself. With a deep breath, Mark stepped forward. "Everyone, listen up," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, despite the adrenaline rushing through him. "We need to fix this, and we need to do it fast. I'm gonna make some calls. Stay on the machines. I'll be right back." The workers exchanged puzzled glances, but no one questioned him. Mark moved quickly, pulling out his phone and dialing the number of the best technician he knew, someone who could fix the problem on the spot. As he waited for the technician to pick up, his thoughts drifted back to Emma. What would she think when she found out? What would she say when she learned that the man she had been working alongside wasn't just some regular worker, but the owner of the entire operation? Just then, he caught sight of Emma standing in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest. She was watching him closely. Her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Mark," she called softly, stepping forward. "What's going on? I know something's not right." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't lie to her anymore. The time had come, but as he opened his mouth to speak, the sound of a car engine roared outside, signaling the arrival of the technician. The tension was unbearable, thick in the air. Would Emma still see him as the man she had come to know? Would everything change? After this, Mark couldn't help but wonder. As he turned back to face her, he had no idea what would happen next. But one thing was certain, he had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. Mark stood frozen as the sound of the car engine outside grew louder. Emma's eyes were fixed on him, her expression a mix of curiosity and suspicion. The technician had arrived, and with it, the chance to save the factory. But for Mark, This was more than just about the machines. It was about finally confronting the truth that he had been avoiding for so long. He couldn't keep pretending. Not anymore. He took a deep breath and turned to face Emma, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no easy way to do this. He could feel the weight of every moment, every decision leading up to this. He could feel the pressure building, and it was all coming to a head. "Emma," Mark said, his voice low but steady, "there's something I need to tell you. Something important." She took a step closer, her gaze unblinking, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "What is it? What's going on?" Her voice was soft, but the concern was evident. Mark ran a hand through his hair, trying to find the right words. "I'm not who you think I am. I'm not just a worker here. I'm the owner of this factory." For a moment, Emma was silent. She blinked, processing his words, her face unreadable. The air seemed to thicken as Mark waited for her reaction. Her expression softened, but there was a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "You're the owner?" she asked, almost as if she couldn't believe it. Mark nodded slowly. "I know this probably sounds crazy, but I wanted to understand what it was like for everyone here. I wanted to feel like a part of something real, not just a guy with a title. I never meant to deceive you, Emma. I just didn't know how to tell you." Emma took a step back, her arms crossed over her chest. She didn't look angry, but Mark could see the wheels turning in her mind. This wasn't what she expected, and he understood that. It was a lot to take in, especially after all the time they had spent working side by side. "Why didn't you just tell me from the start?" she asked, her voice quieter now, tinged with disappointment. Mark sighed. "I was afraid of losing everything. Afraid you would see me as just some rich guy playing dress up. I wanted to be real with you, but I didn't know how." There was a long pause, the kind of silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Emma stared at him for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. Mark's heart raced, waiting for her to say something, anything. And then, unexpectedly, she spoke. "You know I get it," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You've been living in this bubble, surrounded by people who only care about your money. And I can see how that would make you feel disconnected. But Mark, you can't hide from who you are forever, pretending to be something you're not. It's only going to make things worse in the end." Her words hit him like a wave, but there was no anger in her tone, just a quiet understanding, as if she saw through the confusion and pain that had led him to this point. Emma wasn't angry. She was simply trying to help him see the truth that Mark had been avoiding for so long. "I know," Mark replied, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I just didn't know how else to find a way back to something real." Emma smiled gently, her eyes softening. "Well, I can't say I'm happy about being lied to, but I think I understand why you did it. You're human, Mark. We all make mistakes. The question is, what do you do now?" Mark took a deep breath, the weight of his secret finally lifting. It wasn't easy to admit, but it felt like a burden had been taken off his shoulders. He looked at Emma, his heart full of gratitude, and surprisingly, a little bit of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end after all. Maybe it was just the beginning. "I want to make things right," he said, his voice firm now. "Not just with you, but with everyone here. I'm not just going to sit back and watch this place fall apart. I've got the resources, but I also need the trust. I can help Emma, but I need your help too." Emma nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. "What are you asking me?" "I'm asking you to help me rebuild, to show me what it means to lead. Not just from behind a desk, but from the ground up. I've spent so much time running this place, like a business, but I've forgotten what it means to really care about the people who work here." You've reminded me of that." There was a brief silence, and then Emma spoke, her voice steady, but sincere. "Okay, but this time we do it together. No more pretending. No more secrets." Mark nodded, feeling a surge of emotion. He had never expected this. He had never imagined that the woman he had secretly fallen for would be the one to help him find his way back to himself. But here they were, standing together, ready to face whatever came next. As they walked back into the factory to deal with the crisis at hand, Mark realized something profound. His wealth, his status, they didn't define him. What mattered was the way he treated the people around him, the way he showed up day in and day out for the ones who trusted him. And now, with Emma by his side, he knew he had a chance to make things right. The technician had arrived, and the machinery was soon fixed. But Mark's journey was far from over. As he worked alongside Emma and the rest of the factory team to get everything back on track, he felt a new sense of purpose. This was the real world, and it was messy, unpredictable, and full of challenges. But it was also where he truly belonged. And for the first time in a long time, Mark Thompson wasn't afraid to embrace who he was, flaws and all. As the days went by, Mark and Emma's partnership grew stronger, both professionally and personally. They worked side by side, facing the challenges of the factory with determination and honesty. Their bond deepened, and the respect they had for each other only grew. Mark knew that this was the life he had been searching for, a life that wasn't about wealth or power, but about connection, trust, and genuine love. In the end, Mark didn't just save his factory, he saved himself, and in the process, he found the kind of love and fulfillment that no amount of money could ever buy.